Começa agora o programa 20 Minutos com Breno Altman.
Bom dia. Hoje é 11 de novembro de 2021. Estamos dando início a mais uma edição do programa 20 Minutos Internacional. Nosso convidado é o filósofo japonês Kohei Saito. Ele é professor associado de economia política na Universidade de Osaka, no Japão. É também membro do conselho editorial internacional do Projeto Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe, a grande empreitada de consolidação das obras completas dos autores alemães Marx e Engels. Em 2018, Saito venceu o Deutsche Memorial Prize com a obra O Ecossocialismo de Karl Marx, Capitalismo, Natureza e a Crítica Inacabada à Economia Política, publicado no Brasil pela Boitempo Editorial. Antes de começar a conversa, gostaria de pedir que façam uma assinatura solidária de Opera Mundi em nosso site ou se tornem membros pagantes do canal de Opera Mundi no YouTube. A imprensa independente precisa da sua ajuda para se sustentar e se desenvolver. Também peço que curtam e compartilhem esse vídeo, além de ativarem o sininho do canal. São ações que ampliam nossa audiência, nosso engajamento e nossa receita publicitária. Outra forma de contribuir com a Opera Mundi é através do Pix. Nossa chave é apoie@operamundi.com.br. Vou repetir, apoie@operamundi.com.br. A razão social de Opera Mundi é última instância editorial limitada. Como esse programa foi previamente gravado, infelizmente não serão possíveis dessa vez perguntas de nossos espectadores. Mesmo assim, queria pedir que contribuam com o Super Chat ou Super Sticker durante a transmissão. Good morning, Professor Saito. An honor to have your presence at 20 minutes. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Yeah, it's 9 p.m. here, but thank you so much for your invitation, and I'm really excited joining this program tonight.
Professor Saito, for a long time prevailed the idea that Marx's legacy had little or nothing to offer for reflections on ecology. Even important eco-socialist theorists, such as Michel Levy, came to identify anti-ecological elements in the work of the German thinker. You, in your book, disagree with this conclusion. For what reason?
Okay, so even many good Marxists argue that Marx was not really conscious about ecological issues. Rather, he was much more optimistic about technological progress. You know, if you read Communist Manifesto, for example, he seems to believe that capitalism at first is very destructive. So it creates many problems, it exploits workers, but it also, destroys all the communes, etc. But in the end, it will bring about progresses, new technologies, convenient life, abundance of wealth, etc. So he, despite his harsh critique against capitalism, shared nonetheless a very optimistic view of bourgeois progress. That's what critics of Marx says. But the problem is that they only read Communist Manifesto. They don't pay attention to what older Marx said. Marx, when he wrote the Communist Manifesto, for example, he was like middle of 20 something. So he was very young, and he was passionate about the coming revolution in 1848. But in the 50s and 60s, the revolution didn't really happen, and capitalism became very, lively again. He started studying political economy writing Das Kapital, etc. In the process, he started studying natural sciences as well. And then at that time, there was a lot of discussion about sustainability, especially in terms of agriculture. But these study on natural science conducted by late Marx were never published. He integrated some insights into his published writings such as Das Kapital, but even after publishing the volume 1 of Capital, he continued to study more topics on natural sciences, but these things remained basically unpublished. So I basically investigated his notebooks, now published in the Mega that you just introduced in the beginning. They contain a lot of new insights, and I can tell you.
Which is the correct pronunciation of Mega? Marx, Engels?
Gesamtausgabe.
Gesamtausgabe.
Yes, this Mega contains a lot of new materials, natural sciences, especially like agriculture, chemistry, geology, botanic. And if you read those notebooks, as I discussed in my book, Karl Marx Ecosocialism, you will see that Marx was clearly ecologically conscious, and he was criticizing capital's destruction of nature because it destroys our potentiality, the material conditions for free and human development. So new materials change everything, I would say, yes.
I understand. Do you think that the socialist movement after the 19th century was able to develop these Marxist ecological ideas and build an alternative to the insurmountable contradiction between capitalism and nature, or the socialist movement failed in this task?
The problem is that, so as I said, these notebooks were unpublished. It just published 2 years ago or 3 years ago. So until then, people did not really know that Marx was so much interested in the issues of natural sciences, such as exhaustion of soil, deforestation, and stock farming, or exhaustion of fossil fuels, etc. So instead, people just read Engels and Lenin and other people. They rather try to establish the Marx theory as a complete system. The problem is that Marx's critique of political economy remained basically unfinished. Volume 2, Volume 3 were never completed by Marx himself. After his death, Engels edited his manuscripts, right? So when Marx couldn't complete Capital, he left out many issues unelaborated. One is ecology. But the problem is, as Engels, after Marx's death, emphasized Marx's systematic character of Capital and his critique of political economy, he tended to reduce some of the important aspects of Marx's theory, including ecology. And in the end, in the 20th century, the Soviet Union was formed, but they really advocated, after all, a very optimistic productivist tendency without really noticing this Marx's ecological critique of capitalism. Both capitalism in the West, socialism in the East, share the same assumption that the technological progress will be the only foundation for the human emancipation. But that's not necessarily the case. Even at Marx's time, there are a lot of discussion about further technological progress do not automatically solve those problems. People like Peter Kropotkin, William Morris, Élise Lucoulieu, and those people in Russia, France, and the UK also criticized this very positive, optimistic view of technological progress. Marx actually shared some of the opinions with them, but actually in the 20th century, state socialism, I would say, ended up emphasizing this technocratic aspect of, especially in the Communist Manifesto.
Understand. And what about Engels' dialectic of nature?
That's also an interesting point. So many people, like traditional Marxists, assumed that basically Marx and Engels had the same opinion, right? And Marx didn't talk much about nature, and the Engels talked about dialectics of nature, in dialectics of nature as well as in anti-Düring. So people simply assumed that, when we talk about nature, we should refer to Engels. But if we can find dialectics in nature, we can simply observe what's happening in nature, etc., and then apply the objective dialectics into society to predict the future development, etc. But the problem is that the Soviet materialism, like Diamat, ended up falling into a positivist and mechanistic view of society because they simply applied the dialectics of nature into the analysis of society. This is what has harshly criticized by people like Lukács and later by Western Marxism. Western Marxism basically said, no, Engels made a huge mistake. Marx confined his dialectics to society. So we should not really talk about dialectics of nature like Engels did. It's all bad. But the problem is that Western Marxism excluded the sphere of nature from Marxism with Engels. So even today, people like Slavoj Žižek, for example, he says ecology is an opium of masses. And that's not true. Ecology really poses a serious threat to human survival, and ecology is one of the most important issues for the left. So the problem in the 20th century Marxism is that both Orthodox Marxism in the Soviet Union, as well as Western Marxism in France, in Germany, etc., shared the same assumption that Marx didn't have much to say about nature because they neglected notebooks, right? So my project of looking at the mega and reading notebooks, looks boring, right? Like it's just notebooks. It doesn't really, it seems that it doesn't really contain anything new. But once you realize that Marx very intensively studied natural sciences, especially in his late years, while working up on Capital, we can imagine how he would have developed his ecological critique of capitalism if he had completed volume 2 and 3 of Capital. So we have whole new questions and whole new insights opened up by this Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe. This is also what we need for the 21st century when the ecological crisis is so pressing issue.
At what point do you think Marxism would have been influenced by a productivist conception so present in your own words in real socialism, putting the environmental issue in such a secondary position?
So I'm not saying that, Engels and Lenin and maybe after that Stalin were all guilty and Marx is innocent or anything like that. Marx was clearly guilty, at least to some extent. So maybe that's where I differentiate myself a little bit from John Bellamy Foster. If you follow some of the ecological discussions, he would say that Marx was always an ecologist since his dissertation, for example, when he talked about the problem of nature in Epictetus, etc. But my opinion is a little bit different because there are some textual evidence that Marx was quite optimistic about technological progress in the future, and especially in socialism. Once capitalist model production is overcome, we can freely utilize machines and artificial, like chemical fertilizer, and we can, grow anything what we like and whenever we want.
Soil indefinitely.
Yes, the soil power increases every year, etc. But that's kind of stupid idea today, and even Marx realizes that in the 60s. But in the 40s, we have a lot of new notebooks, and the notebooks in 40s actually document Marx was quite a productivist, I would say. So even in the Communist Manifesto, you can find those passages, and to some extent in the Grundrisse, written in the 1858 too. So I would say even up until the end of 1850s, he was quite optimistic about the future. So if you read or if you highlight those aspects, we can have a kind of modernist Marx. And ecological questions will be overcome by technology and productive forces, and socialism can grow even more. But in the 60s, he had a different opinion. He became much more critical about the destructive aspect of productive forces of capital. The problem is that once we get rid of this system of capitalism, the productive forces of capital is also gone. So we cannot really say that socialism can grow even more, or we cannot say that socialism can solve all those issues by technology. So now we can pose a new question, or then what kind of socialism would we have in the future when we cannot really assume that the technological process or the development of productive forces is the driving motor of history. So these new questions that we need to ask, because the Soviet project failed, and we cannot really believe that a further economic growth or further development of technologies would solve today's ecological crisis.
Professor, what's your balance on the environmental issue in socialist experiences? By the way, what all the same all these experiences were the same about environmental issue? Are there differences among them? What's your balance about the practical experience in the relationship between eventually a bitter relationship between socialism and ecology?
I see. So I would say, reflecting upon the history of the Soviet Union or other state socialism in the past, it is absurd to say that socialism is always ecological. I don't think so. The state socialism can be very environmentally destructive, because the problem with environment is material process, which Marx called metabolism, the Stoffwechsel. The metabolism is a process.
Which is the word in German?
Stoffwechsel.
Okay. I think it's easier to learn Japanese than German.
In Japanese, it's 物質代謝. But this process is harder.
As I was a judo practice, I know how to count up to 10.
1、2、3、4、5、7、8、9、10.
I stopped here.
So in any case, the metabolism is a process, material process, the flow of energy and the materials, etc. So that exists independently of social forms. It doesn't matter capitalism, feudalism, or in socialism. They are basically the same metabolic process. So even if we try to grow or economic growth, if we pursue too much economic growth in socialism, that will be bad for environment as much as in capitalism. So then it's quite understandable why the socialism in the Soviet Union had even worse impact upon the environment. They basically managed this metabolic process quite badly because they put more importance on the growth than the sustainability. But that doesn't mean that socialism is worse than capitalism in terms of ecology or in terms of sustainability. I would say that socialism has a better chance of being more ecological. That's what eco-socialism aims after. Why is it more? Why is it? Why does it have better chance? I would say, for example, the market competition is regulated, so it also regulates the production of unnecessary products and selling them by advertisement, branding, and marketing, etc. It can also shorten the working hours. In socialism, we don't really have to work 40 hours every week because everyone shares the equal amount of work and the burden. And also, we can eliminate other unnecessary jobs, and we can share the rest of the jobs together. So that also contributes to reducing the amount of time. And so these things considered, I would say that eco-socialism has much, or the competition of the market price, that they try to produce in capitalism, people try to produce more, and they try to sell as cheap as possible. So that's why we have basically having the huge amount of waste. The more conscious form of production is necessary today, and I would say that's what eco-socialism aims after.
Mm-hmm. Professor, the capitalist world in the last 20 or 30 years began to be interested in environmental preservation. It's a kind of modern disc narrative in the capitalism media, for instance. Would it be possible to overcome the contradiction between capitalism and nature within the capitalist order itself?
So that's what many business people and the capitalist elite believe, or they hope to. The ecological modernization through renewable energy, electric
Clean
vehicles,
energy, green economy, and
green
other
economy,
concepts.
and green growth is the hope
Yeah,
of
green growth.
But the problem is we need to really question whether the further economic growth can be sustainable, especially because when we have to, for example, reduce the carbon dioxide emission to zero by 2050, it means that we have only less than 30 years. We cannot really believe that the further economic growth, which is driven by producing a lot of useless things and fast fashion, fast food, and gigantic cars like SUV, can be achieved by sustaining all those things. I don't think so. We need to, abandon or restrict or regulate those unnecessary or ecologically harmful things, and that requires a social regulation. But that's not something capitalism is able to do because they always try to talk about private property, the market competition, etc. There's a fundamental contradiction. So as long as economic growth is necessary or inherent essential characteristic of capitalism, but when the economic growth is actually what hinders our transition to more sustainable economy, capitalism and sustainability are incompatible today. So I would say that eco-socialism needs to integrate new ideas, that is degrowth. I think when we pursue the path that Marx was pursuing after in the 60s and 70s, he consciously distanced himself from earlier productivist vision, and he became much more interested in ecological questions, and he was also learning a lot of things about pre-capitalist and non-Western societies where people lived in more equal way and in a more sustainable manner. Today, this implication is very important because Marx argues actually that equal society is much more sustainable. In capitalism, today, the economic inequality is a huge problem. And in fact, a lot of rich people in the global north fly a lot, eat a lot of meat. They even fly with private jet, and they have gigantic houses everywhere, possessing many cars, and they have huge amount of carbon dioxide emissions, right? So if we tax them, if we regulate or prohibit what those people consume, like private jet and the space shuttle or whatsoever, we can have much more wealth to share with other people. We can tax them and use that money for guaranteeing everyone housing and food and other necessary services. These activities, essential activities, are much more ecologically sustainable. So by creating equal society in the means of taxing or regulation and prohibition, etc., we can also establish equal and sustainable society. And this is the path that Marx was actually trying to envision in 1870s and 80s. But Marx was not really able to elaborate on those aspects. So that's why we need to look into notebooks, letters, and manuscripts very carefully and bring them back to the 21st century. Then we can have a wholly new imaginary or post-capitalism in the 21st century that was quite unknown in 20th century Marxism.
Professor, isn't there a contradiction between degrowth and generating jobs, feeding people, and fighting against extreme poverty in the world?
Oh, yes. I'm not saying that the degrowth is the best option for the global south, right? I'm sure that the people in Brazil will need, not everyone in Brazil, but that many people in Brazil will still need economic growth. So I'm not calling an immediate transition to degrowth society in those areas. But at the same time, it is not reasonable to pursue further economic growth in global north, I would say, like Japan, the US, and the EU. All those societies are already quite affluent, and they became rich by extracting resources and energies and exploiting people in global south too. So that the people or countries in the global south can develop more and they can access to what they really need for living, we need to secure some resource for those people. For that reason, global north that has already developed too much, I would say, need to move a transition to degrowth society in the global north. But the problem is that we cannot have degrowth capitalism. Degrowth capitalism is a disaster because capitalism is designed with the assumption of eternal economic growth. So like in Japan, the economy is not growing, then we have a lot of problems, including economic inequality, low-paid jobs, long working hours, etc., etc. So we cannot have degrowth capitalism. I think the option is degrowth communism, or as a kind of eco-socialism, because we need to share more when economic growth is no longer the option. We have enough. But the problem in capitalism is that the wealth is monopolized by the few. So we need to share more. We need to revive or rebuild the commons, and we need to secure the basic access to housing, medical cares, education, etc. But that's fundamentally a new direction that's, the word like degrowth is unpopular even among Marxism. So I'm trying to change this. I think in the face of climate crisis today, we cannot really say anymore that eco-socialism can achieve further sustainable economic growth. I don't think that's convincing
an illusion,
anymore.
in your opinion.
Yeah. So I would say we have to really admit that degrowth communism or socialism without growth is a very important theoretical task. And what I'm trying to do currently is to examine whether Marx has something to say about such a new society.
In other words, just socialism, under socialism would be possible at the growth economy.
Because many people, like for example, Michel Levy, he doesn't like the term degrowth because degrowth is too pessimistic, and degrowth doesn't really include or doesn't really pay attention to those areas which need to grow more. For example, we need to have more education, we need to have more medical cares, or we need to have more public housing, we need to have more public transport, etc. So these things need to grow. I fully agree. But the entirety of economy cannot grow anymore. That's simply incompatible with the planetary boundaries, the environmental constraint. So I would say that Marxism really needs to fundamentally change the idea. I'm sure that the Marxists in Brazil or the left in Brazil still pursue further technological progress, green modernization, and economic growth.
Reindustrialization.
But, if everyone tried to do this, we are just simply destroying our planet. In order to eradicate extreme poverty, we need a growth. But after that, we need to somehow carve our progress, right? Not progress, but the economic growth. So I think this is the new questions that Marxism needs to seriously care. And what I try to do in my work, the Karl Marx eco-socialism, is a kind of preparation. If Marx were simply a productivist, we can never have such a conversation about the possibility of Marxism and degrowth. That's impossible. But if Marx was a serious eco-socialist, we can really think, then what would Marx say today in terms of degrowth or the need of new kind of socialism without growth?
Eco-socialism would be a way out just for the richest countries in the world?
For now, yes. But at the same time, when rich countries move a transition to degrowth economy, the GDP or the scale of economy will go down. And then it will create rooms for a further development for the poor countries, especially in Africa, for example. The problem is that as long as the rich countries pursue the further green growth, that will be the model for all other countries. So every country seeks after further green growth, but we don't have enough, for example, lithium or other rare earth, right? And that competition will also destroy a natural environment. In that sense, I think the rich countries has kind of responsibility to envision a new form of affluent life without economic growth. That should be the new model for other countries like China or Brazil or India even. But at the same time, I have to correct that, eco-socialism can be established, or they have the communities, indigenous communities, for example, have a lot of eco-socialist spirit because they had a much more sustainable production, sustainable way of life over many years, and they took care of forests and other natural resources. So in that sense, they are already eco-socialists, I'd say. And since something like that is entirely lost in countries like Japan, the transition to eco-socialism in Japan or in the US need to learn from those indigenous communities. The US people can learn from their own Native Americans, etc. But I think that kind of radical transformation of our conception about well-being, sustainability, and affluence needs to happen. And that's why we need not just natural scientists or economists, but we need philosophers and historians and other post-colonial studies, etc., to have much more intensive dialogue about new conceptions of our way of life.
Does economical degrowth mean populational degrowth, or at least stabilization?
Oh, yeah. Because the rich countries are already declining. The population of the rich countries are already declining. Like Japan, it's gonna we're gonna be half in 70 years or so. So that's also another reason. Economic growth is increasing difficult for developed countries because the population is no longer growing. And also the question is, why do we need economic growth when the population is not growing? The idea of economic growth was necessary because the population was growing in the 20th century, right?
But Professor Saito, sorry for interrupting
No,
you.
bro.
But we have the immigration issue. Many people from the poorest countries are going to the richest countries in order to look for jobs.
Mhm.
So if you don't have economical growth, how to generate jobs for these people?
Oh, the problem. Oh, my answer is by reducing or by sharing work. So it's work sharing. We like easy ones. We don't really need fast food. We don't really need fast fashion. We don't really need other kind of what David Graeber said bullshit jobs. We can sort of eliminate or regulate those industries. Then we have rest of the essential works. Those people who used to work in now prohibited industries can join to work in the essential industries. We can share, everyone can share. And then we don't really need to work 40 hours anymore. We can work 25 hours or maybe even 20 hours. So why do we need to work less? I think it creates more space for individual development, but at the same time, it's good for environment. We work too much, we work too long, and then during work, we use a lot of energy, we use a lot of resources, we use air conditioning, we drive cars, etc. By working less, we don't need technological progress to reduce the environmental impact. So I'm talking about the developed countries like Japan. So the issue would be probably different in Brazil. So that's why I'm very happy that we have this kind of dialogue between Japan and Brazil. My work is translated into Portuguese so that people can react to what I say. No, that doesn't apply to, for example, Latin America, etc. I'd be very keen to learn what you think, and then we can have a further discussions to imagine a more equitable and sustainable way of post-capitalism.
Professor Saito, would the growth represent a comeback to agriculture?
To some extent, yes. What we are experiencing in Japan is that we only have 36 or 37% of food that is produced within Japan. The rest is imported from China.
70%.
70%, almost 70% is import. That's very fragile. In the future, we will have much more typhoons, drought, flood, the abnormal weathers due to the influence of climate change. And then there will be a lot of food shortage and water shortage everywhere. Then we cannot really count on the import, right? Maybe China doesn't export their food anymore, as they didn't. During the COVID-19, they didn't export masks anymore to Japan. That's why we ran out of all the masks in Japan last year. So that could happen with food. But mask, you can just stay at home for a while, or you can use the old mask again and again. But when you run out of food and you cannot produce it within Japan, that's very dangerous, simply put. So in that sense, Japan, for example, concentrated too much on industries like producing cars, computers, etc., and also today the service industries. But we also need to rethink about agriculture. So the degrowth, in terms of economic growth, agriculture is not very efficient way of making money. But in terms of food security, in terms of use values, I'd say that agriculture is quite essential. The one of those essential industries that I mentioned previously. In that sense, eco-socialism or the degrowth communism surely needs to refocus on agricultural questions.
Do you think that the growth should stimulate a change in our feeding customs, in our feeding habits, like the veganism defend?
Sure, of course. So I said fast food and fast fashion, but also, fast food is about eating too much meat, but basically rich countries consume too much beef, for example. And beef is a main driver of climate change. And, the huge impact is actually...
What's the name of the famous Japanese beef? The one which is considered the best meat in the world.
Kobe beef, right?
Kobe. I have never ate this beef. Is it good?
Yeah, I don't eat beef anymore, but yeah, when I was...
Why is so expensive, this Kobe beef?
They are not really industrial production. The farmers take care of each single cows. They're very carefully. So it's not a kind of massive production in the factory style. And they eat a lot of good things to have a better meat, etc. But the problem is that the beef, in any case, has a huge environmental impact everywhere, and especially in Brazil, it's really happening. The deforestation of Amazonian rainforest is partially due to the production of beef, right? And I think it's necessary to rethink about. We really need to question whether we need to eat so much meat every day, and that kind of question didn't really come up within Marxism, I would say. Marxism was still trapped within a kind of productivist view. We used to think that those issues can be solved somehow once we move to socialism. But apparently it's not. And environmentalists were right in that sense. But I think in my book, Ecosocialism, Karl Marx Ecosocialism, I try to bridge the antagonism between the green and the red. And the ecosocialism is a kind of fusion of the green and the red. Now we need to take a next step. We need to have a fusion of ecosocialism and degrowth. Because degrowth people sometimes think that market economy can be sustained, but we can have simply different way of organizing commodity production, that we don't really have to economic growth anymore. But I don't think that's possible. As long as the market remains a dominant social institution, we will have a lot of competition, and we will have a lot of advertisement, a lot of consumption, etc. So these are bad for environment. We need to radically question market economy and capitalism. So that's why Marxism has a lot to offer for degrowth people. But degrowth people don't like Marxism because of this productivism, right? So by rethinking this productivist tendency of Marxism in a critical way, with this concept of eco-socialism, socialism without growth, or even degrowth communism, we can have a new fusion of the left in the 21st century. I think that's what we really need, and especially we need in countries like Japan, US, and Europe. But recently, I really think that we can also have that kind of movement in countries like China, India, and Brazil, especially.
Do you think eco-socialist ideas could be strong enough to drive a new anti-capitalist wave in a world where hunger, poverty, and economic backwardness still affect a third of humanity?
Yes, I think it's more eco-socialism can offer a new insight that economic growth promised by capitalism doesn't really offer a solution. That's a kind of myth, right? It's capitalism always say when we have economic growth, everything will be fine. But in the last 30 years, sure, poverty, hunger, the numbers were less. But it's largely due to the improvement of the living condition in China. The hunger and the poverty in Africa, for example, remain basically the same.
If you pay attention in the numbers, without China, we are going to have a completely different picture.
Yes, exactly. So we can really, have China as a model, but China is a kind of the socialist model. So that's not really capitalism that is working today. Capitalism is creating much harsh environment for those poor people. I don't think that we can continue capitalism under such a pressing climate crisis. So this is a really good opportunity for rethinking the possibility of post-capitalism, because after the collapse of Soviet Union, we sort of lost the imagination for post-capitalism. But the situation is changing in the last 5 years or so. In the US, Bernie Sanders, in the UK, Jeremy Corbyn. But today, even Greta Thunberg is, demanding a system change, not climate change. And she's denouncing basically the myth of eternal economic growth, fairy tale of economic growth. So I think the mindset of the people, especially the young people, are changing in those affluent countries. They have a huge responsibility because they are the ones who basically destroy the planet, and they have the responsibility to transform the system for the future generations as well as for the people in the global south. And that move in the global north can be complemented by the people struggling in the global south for more independence, more economic security, and more indigenous rights, etc. When those movements in global north and south could be unified somehow in the next 20 or 30 years, we can finally have a good conditions for new radical politics, I would say.
Professor Saito, a curiosity, is it too hard to be a Marxist in Japan? How have you been converted to Marxism?
Marxism is actually was quite strong in Japan, especially after the World War II. Marxism became so popular because the communists were did never convert. They kept resisting against imperial Japan. So after the end World War II, they became kind of the intellectual hero of freedom and independence. That's why, for example, the best university like University of Tokyo and University of Kyoto had a lot of Marxist professors in the Department of Economics, etc. But this academic Marxism became quite weak after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I'm the generation, I was born in 1987. When I entered the university, this academic Marxism was almost dead. But at the same time, I'm the generation that doesn't know Soviet Union and that also suffered from neoliberal reforms. So my age has more problem with economic inequality, job insecurity, and now climate change. So gradually, I think the younger generations, especially the younger than mine, are also cultivating critical consciousness, even in Japan. Japan is generally very conservative, but I think the situation is gradually changing, and especially the situation toward or the feeling toward Marxism became somewhat positive again. Like my book has become quite popular. I had a second book that deal with the question of degrowth communism was published, which was published last year, and the book sold more than 400,000 copies in Japan. Wow. This book, yes, this book on
and Marx. I have read that Communist Party electoral numbers in Japan are growing up.
Oh yes, that's also growing up. Even though the relationship me and the Communist Party is not so good, but in any case, there's some kind of revival of Marxist tradition. So that's a positive tendency, I would say, but it's happening very slowly. It's not enough. We need to have a really huge movement for radical system change because the time is running out. Climate change is really a serious threat, and we need to have more inspirations from the US, EU, but also from the Latin America. I wish I could, learn Spanish, and because I assume that there are a lot of movements in Latin America in the last couple decades, and I think this is something really we need to learn in Japan currently.
Professor Saito, we are nearing the end of our interesting and exciting conversation. And I would like to ask you two questions that I always ask my guests when we are closing the interview. The first question, which book would you like to suggest to our viewers? And the second question, which movie or series could you indicate whom follows us?
I would say that the book by I don't know. It's a very spontaneous question. I usually don't watch films, so the second question kind of bothers my brain. But the book I like, I don't know. Oh, one book that really changed my. I mean, you might be already familiar, but the John Bellamy Foster's Marx's Ecology is a really path-breaking book. It opened up a new aspect of Marx's ecology. I developed what he said more in my book, Karl Marx Ecosocialism. But without Foster's book, I would not be able to write my own book. So I would surely recommend everyone to read
John Bellamy Foster,
Marx's Ecology.
Okay.
About the movie about climate change or climate crisis.
Or about anything. You're not committed to ecology movies. And people you want to indicate is going to be welcome.
Oh, recently I watched a movie titled Miss Marx. It's a movie about the daughter of Karl Marx. And I have to admit that Marxism was not just productivist, but also anti-feminist. I didn't know that the daughter of Karl Marx was already so much talking about female rights, and there are a lot of insights about feminism, and that needs to be established in socialism, etc. But I'm a Marxist researcher, but still I didn't know about these passages that the movie was mentioning. So I deeply regretted my own one-sidedness of the history of Marxism. And
this movie is about Eleanor Marx.
Yes, Eleanor. And that was really good. So if everyone, I don't know, it's already available in Portuguese, but the title is Miss Marx. So
Miss Marx. I think it's on YouTube, maybe with Portuguese subtitles. I have read in somewhere about it. Professor Saito, I would like to thank you very much for your time and for this very fundamental conversation. Thank you for the opportunity you gave to our spectators and for myself.
Yeah, sorry for my bad English, and then please edit well and then make a good subtitle so that people can understand better what I say. Thank you so much.
Professor. Thank you. Encerramos assim mais uma edição do programa 20 Minutos Internacional. Nosso entrevistado de hoje foi o filósofo Kohei Saito, autor do livro O Ecossocialismo de Karl Marx, publicado pela Boitempo Editorial e disponível no site da própria editora e em quaisquer livrarias do Brasil. Muito obrigado pela audiência e um grande abraço. Para assistir novamente esse programa e a outras edições dos programas 20 Minutos, se inscreva no canal do Opera Mundi no YouTube. Curta e compartilhe nossos vídeos, deixe seus comentários. O jornalismo de Opera Mundi é mantido com o seu apoio. Faça uma assinatura solidária em www.operamundi.com.br. Com um pequeno valor mensal,
você nos ajuda no desenvolvimento de um jornalismo independente e de qualidade. Obrigado pela audiência e até a próxima.